Couple minutes past 9, so why don't we go ahead and start? We have 24 people on board here. And before we start, I just wanted to, a couple things happened that I got regarding security of Zoom. And I just want to share a couple things that were sent to me by people. This one came actually to me. It says, this came about an hour ago, says your attendees are waiting, and it's got this huge long URL, which I hope people are smart enough not to click on. Geez. But I'm not sure how they got that, because it signifies our meeting, and I only sent an invitation to our members. So that was a little concerning. And then another fellow got a looks like a pretty official Zoom email saying that you're invited to this meeting, and fortunately he did not click on it. But I just wanted to warn everyone that don't click on stuff that you're not absolutely sure of, and know who it came from, because I don't know where these go, but it's probably not any place good.
Yeah.
So
in line with that, a friend of mine works for the Coast Guard, and he got one that said that somebody that he was in contact with tested positive for COVID, and click here to see details and get tested, and it wiped out the Alameda computer system.
Oh, wow.
Yikes.
So don't click.
Well,
where you click.
And I think if they're going to tell you you've been exposed to COVID, they are required to call you. They can't.
Right.
They can't email that stuff to you. They have to call and physically verify who you are and talk to you.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like the IRS doesn't use email.
Yeah. Anyways, just be careful out there who you touch and who you click on.
Okay, so along those same lines, Roger?
Yeah.
I've been getting notices from Zoom saying upgrade to version 5.0.
Yes. That is a good thing to do, but do it through their website.
Okay.
So moving on to today, I did get a number of questions. So our topic today is how to turn how to turn thin on green wood. I want to go through the questions first. And obviously, if you have other questions, that's what this is all about, is ask questions and talk about these things.
Excuse me, Roger.
This is
Jim. Could I suggest that everybody who's not talking mute their mics, please?
Actually, I'll mute everybody. Actually, why don't you guys mute yourself so you know how to do it? And when you want to talk, just unmute yourself. And if you don't know how to do it, if you go to your window in the upper right, there should be a unmute button. So everyone but Alan, you see it there?
On the Mac, it's lower left. On the Mac, it's lower left.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it varies depending on what app you're using or what device.
Okay. And Roger? You find it, Roger? I can mute you. And then, hey, Larry and Bill, could you guys monitor the chat window?
Sure, we can.
And make sure I don't miss something.
Okay.
Okay, Dean. I saw Dean on.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, go ahead and ask your question.
I see a Freudian slip that I've got there, which is kind of funny. So I'm having trouble at times with finishing. Generally, I don't use sanding sealer. I don't even own it. I suspect I probably should, but I either use walnut oil, Danish oil, or polyurethane. Okay? I'm just not good at finishing, and it's unfortunate because I'm relatively new to turning. I get some nicely turned pieces, and then my finishing looks like crap. So one of the problems I have with walnut oil is I get certain spots that are areas where it just seems to drink it forever, and it just doesn't build up doesn't get that type of nice luster, smoothness that I get on other parts of it. And I wonder if that's simply an issue of using sanding sealer before I finish it. So that's my first question. What's kind of funny, I said, if so, are there any no. Yeah, so are there any finishes that I can't put on sanding sealer? First of all, is that going to solve the problem? And what can I use and what can I use sanding sealer with?
So who wants to take that one? We have a finishing expert.
No, yeah, well, okay, sure. An expert is just someone who has slides on a topic. And I do have slides on walnut oil. The drinking up of the oil is very typical, and it depends on the wood. Black walnut is probably the worst about that of any of the woods. And what you're seeing is a difference in the density of the surface of the wood. And it's you got a spot on your surface that's just spongy, and it will just continue to drink up walnut oil until it fills the gap. And the appropriate thing to do is just keep putting the walnut oil until it stops soaking it up. Then you can friction polish, and the walnut oil becomes a sanding sealer because it hardens in the grain of the wood. Now,
so Mike, let me interrupt for a second. So you're saying that I should let it drink up till that goes away before I do the friction polishing?
Well, yeah, before you actually friction polish the walnut oil, yes. Yeah. And, black walnut is the worst, but there are other woods. Cherry will do it every now and then. What you're seeing is actually a place below where a limb came into the wood. And there's a difference in the vascular structure of the wood where it's feeding out to a limb. So you've got basically a deep pool that is just going to continue to drink up whatever finish you put on it.
So I actually thought that the friction polishing might alleviate the problem.
It will if you've got a uniform surface layer of oil. If it doesn't, it'll make it worse.
So and believe me, I think I'm making it worse.
Yeah. What happened? Okay, let's talk about surface appearance. The appearance of a surface is about reflection of light. A photon comes in, ideally you want it to turn around and go back out by exactly the same route. That never happens. The surface of wood looks like the Himalayas to a photon. What we need to do is try to fill up the valleys to make the reflection off the surface as uniform as possible. So if you got a spot that is soaked up the walnut oil or shellac or whatever sanding sealer you put on there, you've got coated, uncoated, coated. So that uncoated spot is never going to reflect the light the same way the rest of it does. However, if you keep filling keep putting the oil on, eventually you will saturate that soft spot so that, Harvey, I didn't realize your beard was so brown. You saturate that spot so that
I heard that.
It's very becoming.
Thank you. Thank you.
When you saturate that spot, when you friction polish it, now you've got a uniform surface that's going to reflect the light in a more uniform fashion. So you don't see the splotchy, is sort of the name that I've taken for it. Now, if you're using other things, when you see if you're using, say, poly, and you see a splotch, a spot that's not filled up, sand it off, seal it with shellac, and then go back to your polyurethane. The trick is you've got to make your surface as uniform as possible. This is one of the reasons I like the wet sanding with the walnut oil, because you're saturating the wood the entire time you're sanding. So you're less likely to find that dead spot when you get to your final sanding and you're ready to start finishing.
Oh, yeah, and I do wet sand with the walnut oil, but I still get that splotchiness.
Still get that splotch? What kind of wood?
Gee, it's various kinds. Trying to think of the last one I did where I had the problem. I can't recall offhand.
Yeah.
Not too good on identifying woods. I usually get it from around the neighborhood.
Was it
Dark, Bill, I got that
dark
piece of
brown
cherry.
or white? Like I said, black walnut is bad about it. Cherry is bad about it. Big leaf maple, not so much. Burl's very seldom because they're not uniform grain in any way. So they all sort of take it up the same.
Yeah, the maple I've got finishes fairly nice when I've done it with maple.
Yeah, it's a more uniform wood. And because the maples tend to be bigger than some of the other trees that we work with, you don't have that branch deformity in grain structure. So when you see a spot,
if the wood is really, really dry, it'll drink it forever, it seems.
oh yeah.
Yeah, and therein lies the problem because I keep putting it on, trying to get that splotchy part to, so I could pour the jar of oil on it. Then it would drink it all up,
I think that's unlikely, but yeah, I get what you mean.
Frank,
the other way to do it is a sanding sealer before you start to put anything onto it. There are commercial sanding sealers, the cellulose sealer, which is lacquer, which will limit the other top coat finishes you can put onto it. Poly goes on to lacquer, okay. Shellac is the simplest one. Take a can of shellac, cut one part of shellac with 2 parts denatured alcohol, and I keep that in a spray bottle by the lathe anyway. So you just spray it onto the wood. It soaks in very quickly, and that will get rid of most of your splotching. Then you can go to a walnut oil top coat. Because it's diluted, it sinks into the wood very quickly and pretty deep. So you can still put a walnut oil finish on that, or poly or lacquer, or whatever else you want.
So you had mentioned to dilute it with 2 parts of denatured alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's a segue into my part 2. So what's the best way to apply poly as a finish? Sometimes I have pieces that I want to have a greater shine on it.
Mm-hmm.
So I use poly, and I wonder if I should dilute it. And should I dilute the first coats? What's funny is here I put, should final coats be deleted? Yeah, sometimes I want to take the final coat. I want to delete the whole piece.
My experience with poly is very limited, mostly because I don't like the look. So I have not gained much experience with it. Any diluted, what you can say, and I've used spar varnish quite a bit, and that sort of falls into it. Any finish that you dilute is going to penetrate the wood a little bit better. Polyurethane does not go into the wood very well. It sits on top. And which is one reason why people think poly will cover up a multitude of sins. In fact, it amplifies them, because what it does is magnify whatever condition the surface of the wood is in. So with spar varnish, I dilute that about 50-50 for the first coat, just to get it into the wood a little better. So
Frank, you had a comment?
Well, I am a novice at this, so bear with me, but 2 terms, sanding sealer and friction polish, I've been looking up online and trying to find out about, and there's no consistency, and there's hardly even a definition of what you're talking about. So I wondered if someone could just briefly explain when they use them and what that means. Like
friction polish is friction polish, the noun. That is a friction polish.
Okay.
Anything that requires
that
friction,
Mahoney's, I can't see what.
That's all right. It's a bottle of high build friction polish.
Oh, okay.
Anything that requires the heat of friction to actually set it is a friction polish.
Okay.
You can make the argument that just a layer of wax, because you polish the wax to melt it and spread it evenly. And there's friction polish, the verb. When you are melting that wax to spread it evenly, you are friction polishing.
Okay.
Okay. Now, a sanding sealer, that's an old term. It just you use a sanding sealer before you start sanding or after you're done sanding, just as a way to, well, it does a couple things. It strengthens the surface so your sandpaper cuts a little bit better, or it actually can seal the surface so that your top coat finish goes on more uniformly.
And you could use it either time. That's what's confusing before.
Well, it's like a Kleenex. Not all tissues are Kleenexes, and not all adjustable end wrenches are crescent wrenches. Sanding sealer, I guess, has become a term of art to mean any sort of material you put onto the surface of wood to improve your finishing techniques. So,
a good example of sanding sealer to use is like if you ever want to fix a spot with a CA glue, if you spray what Mike had there, 1 part shellac and 2 or 3 parts denatured alcohol, spray that around where you want, then you won't get any stain from the CA glue if it goes outside of where you want.
Right.
Gotcha.
And so I also keep a bottle like Mike says around and spray that on when I'm doing.
What's a useful thing? If you got a spot that's not cutting very well, spray it with that diluted shellac and you stiffen the grain a little bit and you get a better cut. Same is true of sanding. You got a spot that's not, not behaving, stiffen it with a little shellac and it will sand a little bit better. So it's useful to have for any number of things.
Good. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. That was so confusing trying to read about it.
So well, I do use poly, and I can share some of the things that I've learned about poly. This particular bowl I just did yesterday, and because I want a very gloss finish, but I also had a bark inclusion here that I wanted to seal and preserve. But when I use the wipe-on poly, there's a distinct difference between dry and cured. And that's the first thing I learned about wipe-on poly, is it says you can recoat it after an hour, but you're going to just cause yourself more work if you do. So I get it sanded, I blow it out with air, and then I put a very light coat of poly. I let that dry at least 24 hours, and then I sand it with either 1000 grit or with a real fine. I don't like to use the steel wool. I like to use the synthetic steel wool instead. But I just want to break the surface, and then I'll put another light coat. And after you get to about the 3rd coat, then it really starts to shine, and you can actually see it. But the more coats you put on, the longer I wait, because
John, can I ask a question about that? Do you dilute the poly at all?
I do not. I just put it on thin.
And when you put it on thick, so when you
thin.
So when you put it on, do you literally wipe it on, or do you wipe it on while put it on while it's turning?
No, I take it off the lathe, and I stole these from my wife. They're makeup sponges. So they're for applying makeup, and they work great on the poly, on the wipe-on poly, because they don't leave any streaks. So you don't get any brush marks.
Yeah, and I get that streaking problem. I usually put it on with I got an old T-shirt that I cut up into pieces.
And you're probably putting it on too thick.
Yeah, the thinner the coats to start with, the better.
So I start really, really thin, and then I let it dry for at least 24 hours before I go back, and then I'll take the synthetic steel wool or 1000 grit or 1200 grit and smooth the surface down. Then I'll put the 2nd coat on, and I try to wait 2 days. But the point being that there's a difference between dry and cured, and it takes. I think I read somewhere it can take up to 30 days for it to fully cure. But you really want to wait and let it get really hard on the surface before you go and add multiple coats, or it's going to not be clear.
I think there's two ways of doing that, because I think poly will melt the underlying coat, which is why if you want to apply multiple coats quickly, you do it within an hour or so. You can start to build up, but you can't sand them between. I believe that's true. It's not a good idea to sand them between those coats, but if you let it dry, then you do want to put a little roughing on it. Anyone else?
Yeah, this is Jim Shuffle. I use Wipe On Poly. It's sort of my go-to finish for things other than bottle stoppers or birdhouse ornaments that I make. Go for bowls, platters, all that kind of stuff, vases. I use Wipe On Poly. I buy bin wax, and I use it straight out of the can, put it on with cut up t-shirt pieces. And as John said, the important thing is don't put it on too heavy. Put it on very thin coat. And I like a satin finish, so I use the satin version of it. And my first coat, I sand my piece to probably 320, sometimes 400. And then I'll put a thin coat on and let it sit for about 24 hours. And then I'll sand it to usually 320 on that coat. And then I'll put another coat on and let it sit till the next day. And then I might sand it with 600, or sometimes just go over it with that synthetic steel wool stuff, the white, what's it called? Yeah, Scotch Brite. White Scotch Brite pads, not the gray ones or the other colors, the white one.
Not the red. Don't use the red.
Not the green, not the gray. And that will knock off any little nubbins that might be there from, I don't know, bubbles or dust or whatever. And then I'll put another coat on. And I'll do that anywhere from 3 to 6 coats. And I get a finish that I really like. And it's got a luster to it. It's not shiny bright, because I'm not a fan of the shiny bright ones like a lot of people are. And I really like it because it goes on easy, and it's, I guess over the time I've developed sort of a technique doing it, so it's reproducible and not a lot of trouble. Occasionally I'll have a piece that just doesn't work right, and I'll sand it back all the way to bare wood and start over. But
so just a quick dumb question, if I can. Both you guys have referred to it as wipe on poly. If it's not wipe on, what is it?
Brush on.
Oh,
it's a brush
so
on.
I do wipe it on. It comes in a can. It doesn't say wipe on it, but it.
Yeah. And my understanding is that wipe on poly is just a factory diluted version of the regular poly, which you can make. But
you see that?
And the wipe on poly says on the can, do not dilute. Well, over time, because I don't use a lot of it, because I don't get in the shop too often, it thickens up. And when it's getting a little thick and not going on conveniently the first time, I'll thin it down with a little mineral oil, mineral spirits.
Yeah, that good, because that was my next question, because I don't have diluted alcohol. I need to go get some, but I use mineral spirits when I do the diluting, and because I do it out of a can and it doesn't say wipe on. I see that, John. Appreciate that. I might go get some. I just use poly, so I guess I make it a wipe on poly by diluting it with mineral spirits. That's what causes my streaking, I think, because it's
Thick.
too thick.
My experience, you got to make sure you put it on very thin coat. If you try to rush it, it's going to sag on you or drip,
Right.
or take forever to dry. You're not saving yourself any time.
And for that reason, when I'm doing poly, I leave the tenon on until the inside is done. So that, like Jim said, if I mess this up and I got to go back on the lathe with it and sand it, I leave the tenon on it until I'm done, and then I'll cut the tenon off and finish the bottom.
That's good advice.
Larry, you do a lot of lacquer work. You have any comments on lacquer? I'll unmute you. There you go.
Well, like Polly, thin is good. A lot of thin coats, and lacquer can be finished, refinished much quicker, or second and third coats much quicker than a wipe on poly. You can go 15 to 30 minutes and put multiple coats on. But if you get too thick, it's gonna run. It's gonna orange peel on you. You got to be thin.
The same is true of spar varnish. I use that mostly to when I refinish a bamboo fly rod. It needs to be the way you refinish the fly rod is you actually have a tube with your spar varnish in it. You dip the rod into it and you draw it out slowly. If you see any sort of sag in the finish, you have to dilute it more and start over. So thin seems to be the consensus condition of the high polymer finishes.
Good. Well, that takes us up to the next question. Jeff, you're on, I think. One of his questions was, what type of finishes are considered food safe? And we certainly did a lot of research on that for the bowls of courage bowls. And I think it's well known that any finish, once it's cured, is food safe. But the public doesn't always buy into that. So the finish that we put in the beads of courage boxes are journal finishes, salad bowl finish, which is maybe Mike can tell us exactly what that is, but it's very thin.
The idea that any finish once cured is food safe is almost always true. It depends how it dries. Now, walnut oil, poppy seed oil, linseed oil, tung oil are called drying oils because they will harden naturally. They don't need any sort of chemical catalysts to get them to form a solid polymer. Most of the commercial oil-based finishes are not drying oil finishes. What they have are called drying agents. And there's you can actually go in and buy something called Japan dryers, which are really not a good idea. There are volatile dryers that will actually gas off with time. Most of the drying agents, for example, any of the, I was thinking of a brand name and all I could get is Winco, and that's not right. The finishes, Watco. All of the Watco finishes I've looked at use drying agents, and most of them use the metal ion dryers. Now this is cadmium, arsenic, cobalt, and these do not volatilize off. These stay in the finish. So those finishes I don't think ever become food safe. Or not, depending on how you want to look at it. Caveat emptor. The volatile dryers, they're fine, because as it sets, they lose. The dryers go away. The idea that when you scratch a dried surface, you expose uncured finish, that's also true. But like I said, after 30 days, you could call everything except the Japan dryer hardened finishes food safe.
One question I have is, some products are called cutting board oils, and they say they use a mineral oil. What kind of oil is that?
It's mineral oil. It's paraffin oil. It's horse laxative. It's actually, people that use it in large quantities, that's what they buy. They buy it from veterinary supply houses. It's mineral oil. It's
petroleum product.
I'm assuming it's considered food safe if it's meant to go on a cutting board.
Well, yes and no. Mineral oil.
It used to be used as a laxative.
Still is. That's where you'll find it at the drugstore in the laxative aisle. It's a petroleum-based oil. To my mind, mineral oil is one of the worst things you can put on wood. Not because it's dangerous in and of itself, except that while it's on the wood, it becomes a platform for bacterial growth. The bacteria can actually grow on the surface of it. I used to do, anyway, just platform for bacterial growth. But it evaporates. It does nothing for the wood. Now, the cutting board oils usually will have beeswax, which may be the second worst thing you can put on wood. A lot of people love it. It's fine. If beeswax is cut with a little bit of carnauba wax, it's fine. But a pure beeswax will start to turn to a white powder in the presence of oxygen. And I've kept an example of that.
What are you trying to show, John?
This is the stuff, Howard's, that has food grade mineral oil stabilized with vitamin E, beeswax, and carnauba wax.
Yeah.
And
now that one is not going to dust. Let's see if we can. You see the white spots on that? You old timers will recognize the Eleavacera earring rack project. But that's what beeswax does in a pure state. It turns to a white powder. But like I said, if it's beeswax stabilized with carnauba wax, it'll be okay.
So Jeff had another question, and this is sort of weird, is on the columns, and there's a picture there. Can you tell us a little bit what that is, Jeff?
Well, anybody that has seen a 100-year-old house has seen porches that have columns. And the base of the column, there's a turned section, as well as usually a square block below it. Well, I need to replace the turn section. I'm just curious if anybody has, and this is not a bowl, obviously.
It's a big spindle.
That's what it looks like, is a big spindle. And the turn part of this is about 1.5 inches, maybe 2 inches tall, and 9 to 12 inches. It looks to me like a piece of construction cedar, turned to match that would serve well.
I did my parents' porch in Montana on their log cabin. And from my best guess, this was a 1898 log cabin that somebody added a porch sometime around the 20s. And that, I'm pretty sure, was made out of hemlock.
So what's your question, Jeff?
Well, I just was just curious if somebody had done anything like this and had any recommendation. I'm relatively new to wood turning, and I've done very few spindles, so to speak, and this looks like a giant spindle that you'd do the turning with a spindle gouge, I guess is what you'd call it.
I don't know. Anyone have a comment? I think you can use any gouge you want, whether it's a bowl gouge or spindle gouge, but it's going to be a big piece. You said.
So this is Harvey. I'm curious. It looks to me from the way the wood is split like it's sitting on a mitered base, and then there's the turned section above that. And if I didn't know what to do, I'd think that was face grain turning, just like a board.
Mm-hmm.
But are you planning on turning the entire column or just the base?
Oh, just the base.
Oh, good. Yeah, I'll bet that's a face grain, or you could do a face grain turning, or you could miter up a piece if you didn't want the grain variation on the face grain.
You want to explain what a face grain turning is, Harvey?
I can try. So spindle turnings, the grain runs parallel with the bed of the lathe, and There are certain tools you can use, like spindle roughing gouges and skew chisels and things like that, that cut the wood beautifully because it's running parallel to the bed of the lathe. But face grain projects are where the grain is running perpendicular to the bed of the lathe. And so when the wood spins, you have sometimes end grain, sometimes side grain. And that's where you need to use bowl gouges and things like that to get a decent finish.
Mm-hmm.
So Jeff, take us some pictures when you get this done and show us what you end up doing.
Yeah, that'd be neat.
I certainly will. You know, if you walk around my old neighborhood in the Hollywood district, every third or fourth house has got columns like this. And if you look online and look for Greek columns, you find iconic columns, and pretty soon you're looking at the Supreme Court. And they're all like this. They've got a column with a turned circular section and then a square base.
Yeah.
The other thing to remember is that there's probably a tenon that goes into the base of that column. It's not a flat piece. So because they had the tenon and then they built the column around it. So taking it apart may be a bit of a challenge. Unless it's completely rotten, you might do better to fill the gap and even it out and leave the piece there.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think everyone's heard of Bondo for cars. They have a product now, Bondo for wood, that apparently works pretty good, but they say you can Bondo it.
Well, I have a retired carpenter neighbor that I was going to have help me, and there are jacks you use to sort of hold the porch up, or you lift it up a quarter inch to slide these pieces out. So we'll, I guess until we open it up, like so many things on an old house, until you do it, you don't know what's in there.
Yeah.
Take pictures, share them later.
Yeah. All right. I'll do that.
Your last question could take several hours to talk about. There's someone that wants to give a 5-minute answer to this, and we can get on to the topic question.
From my point of view, Roger, I would say YouTube, there's great videos on YouTube from all the major, most popular instructors on YouTube that are just excellent. And like you said, it is a big, big topic.
I agree, Mike, and I think that the grind angle and what is it best for is depending on what you're trying to do and what the wood is. I have several different angles that sometimes I'll try it on maple and it doesn't cut as clean, and I'll try a different angle and it will. So I think that's a very subjective and broad question.
So the answer is anywhere between 35 and 55 degrees.
Yeah.
And some would go as high as 70 if you want to include the bottom gouges.
Yeah.
I have a couple of those too.
Yeah.
So as somebody who hasn't figured out the answer to that question yet, I do have a suggestion, which is to pick one that you can sharpen reliably and stick with it for a while until you understand what it will do and won't do. I think most grinds can do, at least if you're talking about bowl gouges, most grinds can do most of the functions and do them reasonably well. And for me, it's turned out to be more important to have a consistent grind, so the tool's always behaving the same way, and then practicing a whole bunch with it.
I think that's a great answer, because you build muscle memory. And I know when I resharpened something at a different angle and I went to use it, it just didn't feel right.
Yeah,
and
right.
I think it's the muscle memory that you want to build up to and keep it the same.
I was going to say too, Harvey, I will second, I'll third that, your comment. I think it's really important to, for the first 5 years, I stuck with a 65-degree bowl gouge because that's what David Ellsworth said to use. So the first 5 years, I didn't ever change that angle. And I got really good at replicating it, but even more importantly, I understood how it cut, or I could just feel how it cut, like Roger said, the muscle memory. And then after a while, I tried a different grind. I tried a 40-degree, or then I tried a 55-degree. And I could feel the difference in what that bevel angle did to the wood. So I think sticking with one, just finding one that you want to use, and staying with that, and really understanding what it does and the feel and all that is a good practice.
And the other important thing Harvey said was an angle that's easy to sharpen. And if you're using the one-way jig, there's different settings on that little device. And I'm using the one that comes from the Thompson brochure. That tells, set it this way and you'll be happy for the rest of your life. And so far it's worked okay for me. And I think it's in the 45-degree, if I remember right. It's around 45 or so, but whatever you pick, make sure you can replicate it.
Reproducible sharpening is among the many important things that Harvey said.
Yeah.
Reproducible sharpening is the most important one.
Yeah.
Yep.
Hey, there are a couple chat questions that have popped up, Roger. I don't know how you want me to.
Go ahead. Why don't you lead it, Bill?
Okay, so Tom Willing said, does anyone pre-wet with mineral spirits before applying the first coat of poly?
I've never had.
No.
And there's another one then.
You
Don't
want
leave my poly question quite yet. I've seen boat builders do that with varnishes on fresh teak and materials like that. And I've never heard of anybody using it in wood turning, and I was just curious.
The reason the boat builders do it, particularly on teak, because it's an oily wood, is you're cleaning off some of the oil on the surface of the wood. It's like, it'd be like turning ebony or cocobolo. So you clean the oil off the surface of the wood, plus you're diluting your finish at the surface. So you're going to get a little quicker penetration into the wood. So in boat building, that makes great sense. And actually with any sort of, in a wood turning application, if you want to get the finish to penetrate, that dilution at the surface, you get sort of this gradient of diluted poly going into the wood. Doesn't sound like a bad idea.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, the boat builders also they'll use not lacquer thinner on a glue joint with teak for that same reason, to get the teak oils out of it. Otherwise, you get joint failure pretty quickly.
Yeah.
I had an observation about the plinth for the column. The square part of the plinth is typically used to make up the difference between the drainage pitch on the porch and the horizontal pitch across the bottom of the column. So there's some adjustment things that have to happen there that can be a little tricky. It's just a heads up.
There's another question from Tom Hansen about green wood preservation. Sealed slabs or sealed rounds wrapped in plastic? Rounds as in blanks.
I think we talked a little bit about that on the first meeting. Go ahead, Tom.
Oh, I'm just saying, I'm having a hard time losing a bunch of greenwood blanks before I can pre-turn them just to cracks. And I'm just curious, is there a way to avoid that, and what would be the best?
Go ahead.
I will treat the circumference of my blanks with anchor seal if I'm not going to get to them right away. And sometimes I'll even either wrap a rough bowl or wrap a rough bowl with plastic, or use anchor seal, depending on what I'm up against and what I have time to do.
Can I expect all wood to crack after a certain amount of time, or
Hope
I mean,
not.
even if you build it?
Depends on the type of wood.
Yeah.
Left
I have
to
a
its
lot
own
of ash.
devices, probably.
Yeah, I have a lot of ash that from a big tree that came down on my place, and it cracks no matter what you try to do.
Yeah.
So
But other woods don't. Maple doesn't do that. I have good luck with anchor seal, as Tom said, on the circumference. In fact, sometimes I do the whole thing depending on how long it's going to sit. And I've also seen good results with the saran wrap. It's way wetter with the saran wrap. When you unwrap it, it'll probably spalt a little bit if that's what you want. Handy way to get spalting.
Can't you avoid some cracking by breaking the wood down a little bit before you store it, like splitting it in half, because you tend to get cracking along the pith, and then there's the whole rough turning thing.
Well, if you have very little time, what I've seen people do, the people that do this kind of thing for a living, they will always anchor seal over the edge, never leave an exposed edge uncut. And I've actually seen them take an angle grinder and round off the edges so that you don't have a square edge. And that's where it cracks most easily. So what I do is I don't round off the edges. I'll anchor seal it and go, a couple of inches onto the flat surface so that the edges are completely covered. And then I wrap it in saran wrap, taking no chances. And I very seldom have a blank split.
That's good to hear. That's good news.
Is that a whole log? I mean, an entire round, or do you split it?
Well, I've lost a lot of wood, and I've done it a bunch of different ways. I first started leaving them in rounds as a whole, 18-inch chunk. Then I've experimented with just cutting it straight down the pith and leaving it in 2 sections. I've cut them in slabs with exposed top and ends. And then I've cut them also into the actual round blanks. I've lost a few every way I've tried, so I'm just curious if there's one way that's better.
What kind of wood is it?
All kinds of wood. Now, most of the wood I just tossed out, granted, was fruit wood, so that's part
fruit
of
wood is the hardest thing to keep from cracking.
Fruit wood is cracking as the tree is falling before it hits the ground.
Yeah.
It just sucks to throw out.
If you're not treating as the tree falls, you're already too late.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you.
Go find some maple and you won't have any trouble.
That's the problem, finding maple.
Ashley Harwood is someone that.
Go ahead.
So Ashley Harwood is someone that I follow quite a bit. She's a production turner and instructor, and she's talked a few times about you got to be willing to let some stuff go, especially if you want to be, if you're trying to become like a known turner, you got to be willing to cull the herd a little bit. I've heard a couple of production turners talk about that. And just know that some amount is going to crack, especially when you get into fruit woods, you're going to lose some. But my understanding and what I've had success with is, make sure that you cut it and remove the pith. So, depending on how big the log is, you can remove a couple of inches around the core of the wood. That's going to automatically reduce your risk of cracking significantly. And then all the things that have already been talked about, waxing or sealing the ends, wrapping, anything to slow it down, because the cracking is when you have that differential. Some of it's drying and shrinking faster than others. So if by slowing down the fastest drying parts of the wood, it'll dry a little more evenly and you reduce your risk of cracking. But again, just know that some of it's going to crack, and wood, it grows on trees. So, unless it's something really, really special, and even when it is, you might not be able to prevent it, and just know that you're going to lose a fair bit.
Well, thanks. I want to get on to the topic from Arnie, which is a very interesting topic. Arnie, you want to sort of state what your question is?
There we go. Yeah, I'm trying to turn thinner, turn thinner and thinner as I'm developing my skills. And I get inconsistently thin and I go through the bottom or through the side. So I'm just trying to find out how other people turn thin and get it consistent without creating funnels like I've been doing. both wet and dry wood.
Who's the Irish guy who does the turning with the backlight?
Yeah, I've used a light.
Are good.
I don't know. You want to give us your experience with thin turning, Tom?
Yeah, it's a lot of fun to do this trick. Takes a steady hand, but a little practice will get you there. When you get your bowl, I'm assuming you're turning bowls or something of that sort.
Yes.
When you get it down to a relatively thin wall, turn off all the lights in your shop except for one real good bright one, and put it on the backside so you're seeing through the wood. And when it's turning, the light pattern will be fairly even. And you can, I've taken stuff down to 1 millimeter that way. I've blown up a lot of pieces too, but they don't hurt too bad when they're that thin, when they hit you.
You know, Stuart Batty had a comment about thin turning that I hadn't thought about. He says on a number of pieces, if he wants to turn thin, he turns the inside first and then makes it thin from the outside.
Yeah, I remember that.
I've never tried that.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but you know, it's easier to turn the outside than the inside, and I don't know. Anyone has tried that?
I've tried it. It does work.
I tried it because you could shine the light inside.
Yeah. If I'm going to make something very thin, I use this or one that's a little smaller. And the only thing about it is that this little spring-loaded doodad, you adjust to the thickness you want. Your gouge is here. You adjust that thickness to the final thickness that you want. And it's like the laser beam. As you turn, you have a way to tell exactly how thick you are in any particular point.
So how does that work, Mike?
Well, okay, it slides over the gouge. I've got a couple of different sizes of this. It slides over the gouge through there, and you set, this arm is a screw, and you set the distance between the bead and the gouge to approximate the thickness you want. So as you're going down the inside, the closer your bead gets to the outside of your bowl, or whatever you're turning, the closer you are to that thickness that you set beforehand. So this
mechanical laser light.
Yeah, and I've had not good luck with laser lights. This always works. It's just
Can you use that with a hollower?
You can use it with anything that you can get through the hole. Now, I'm trying to think if I've used it with a specific hollowing tool.
So is that a commercial product or something you made?
No, this is a piece of lab stand from my lab, and a screw from I think probably Home Depot, and a spring. And this is actually a colored chart dot push pin. So no, it is not a commercial thing. I think there are people that make them. You remember Jack DeVos?
Yeah.
Years and years ago. I was going to recollect his class, but is Barb here? No. We'll talk about that another day. Anyway, Jack DeVos made something like that for his gouges. And I like, God, what a good idea. So I have one for my little ornament hollowing tool. It's easy to do, and it's a good approximation. And sometimes it's difficult to measure the thickness in some parts of the bowl, whereas that one, you can always see what it is. Anyway, that's how I do it.
So Mike,
Bill, what do you do when you turn thin? I think I caught him off guard.
Oh yeah.
Sorry about that. I turned my video off. I was going to say, with turning thin, I just measure a lot with, I think I've showed a lot of people and given away a lot of the, that aluminum kind of loop that I use that David Ellsworth has done for years. I just measure, you cut, you stop, you measure, you take your time to go through it, again, you start at the rim of the bowl, and I leave as much mass in the middle as possible, and then start in at about an inch, and just keep kind of whittling down that inch, and measuring, and before I go all the way down to the bottom. When you are shaping the bowl, if you're going to turn thin, don't hollow it out. Don't take all of the mass out of it, because it starts to kind of just wobble and go off center, and you'll be hitting air and then wood and air and wood, and it just distorts so much. Even this one, I did this yesterday, and just to kind of turn a thin scrap piece of burl, and this was a knot, by the way. I didn't catch it, but you just start at the rim, go a little ways down, and hollow that or thin that out to the thinness that you want your final piece to be, and then go and take more mass out, another inch or so, depending on how big the bowl is and how fast you're turning and what type of wood it is. But just go incrementally down the bowl, and that's how I do it. Again, I take my time. Some people will spray it with water if it's wet wood to keep it wet, to keep it from distorting. This was a piece of pretty dry maple burl, so and it did distort as I was going down it. So just again, take your time and go incrementally.
Thank you. I think the key is once you do that first inch, you never go back.
Yeah.
To the next inch, you never go back.
That's exactly right.
Thank you.
Also, there's nothing morally wrong with the 80 grit gouge. A lot of times you can finish that last thinning by using sandpaper. Plus, you can also, if you're working the inside, you can hold the outside with your hand in a pair of gloves, so that it doesn't move quite as much. There's lots of ways to do almost everything.
Bill,
another one of the things that Stuart Batty said when he was here was that he turns it to a consistent thickness all the way through, and then on that final pass, and he doesn't do the 1 inch, 1 inch, 1 inch. He does the whole thing all at once, but he leaves it at a constant thickness all the way through, and then that final pass, because he knows it's a constant thickness, if he takes a constant cut all the way down, he can have it pretty thin. But he said that takes years of practice, so that it might be a little bit beyond what we are. But Bill, is this what you were talking about with the loop?
That's exactly
this is how I measure.
Yeah, that's exactly what I use. I have about 5 of those.
Instead of paying $50 for a big figure 8 caliper, you just take some heavy gauge wire, and then this can do a lot more than a lot of those figure 8 calipers.
Yeah. Agreed. I have about 5 or 6 of those different sized ones, from this big to the size that you have, and they're just right within arm's reach of my lathe. I turn the lathe off, I measure, put it back on the hook, and then turn it on and go. So.
Any idea what gauge wire you use?
I don't remember. It was something from Home Depot. Mm-hmm. It's just something heavy enough that it'll hold its shape reasonably well.
I brought I think it was the last tool swap, or maybe the year before. I made a bunch of those and gave them out to a bunch of people. But yeah, I bought a big roll of it. It was like, I don't know, $14 or $10 for more than I have ever used, and from Home Depot.
Sounds like a good thing for the newsletter.
Oh, okay.
Do you set the gap to the desired thickness and then?
Yes, and that's
going until it's not pressing up against the wood?
Well, you go a little further. So say if you wanted a bowl about that thin, I would space it about like that, and then the space between the outside of the rim and the wire should be consistent. You know, like it will. If it's not consistent, it'll be like, oh. Does that like just a uniform negative space between the side of the bowl and the here we go. And I rub the inside of the piece. Yeah, that'd be a good newsletter.
You know, I might add to that Bill had given me a piece of that and showed me that when I was over at his shop once. And as a relatively new turner, that's one of the tools I use most often. So it works really well. Now, I don't do stuff that's real thin, and yet it still works really well for me. So to get it uniform.
What gouge are you using or tool to do your final cut, Bill?
I am using either my 55-inch Ellsworth grind or a 40/40. I love them both now, so I kind of use them both. The 40 won't go down all the way, you know, into the bowl. As Stuart says, you get about 2/3 of the way down. It's a beautiful cut, 2/3 down. But then once you start getting the end grain and the bevel angle, you're going to be bumping the.
So you're doing your final cut on the inside rather than the outside.
Yes. Yeah.
Or a bowl scraper is another good way to do it.
Yeah, you can use a bowl scraper or a negative rake scraper.
What little I've done is with a negative scraper, but you still get so much chatter in there, and then you get tear out with a scraper.
Yeah.
And some of that, it has to do with the fact that you've taken all the mass out. And
it's because it's so thin.
Distorting in doing that. So it's, and every wood is different, and even different pieces of the same species is different.
Yeah.
So Bill, when you said you leave a lot of mass in the bowl, are you leaving it in the very center of the bowl? Or just in the bottom?
I'm basically hollowing out. I'm sorry. If this were a solid piece here, I would cut in about this much, all the way, you know, and then work on the thickness of it, and then I will go another inch in, taking all of that mass out. I don't make a cone or anything like that. You can do that too if you want to. I don't think there's any rule either way, but that's just how I've found the easiest way to do it.
So you're leaving a lot of mass in there.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about that. I thought maybe you took it down to like an inch thickness and then went back to the top and then took it thin.
I've done that as well. And I don't know, I can't tell you if one way is better than the other, but how I do it now is, if I'm turning, then that's if I'm turning really thin stuff. Like this, I think I may have done what you just said, which I, go about an inch and then down to here. This isn't that thin of a bowl. So, I mean, it's thin, but it's not that thin. So I didn't use that inch increment.
Gotcha.
That I was talking about before.
Are you turning them wet or dry? You're muted.
This was a roughed out bowl that was inch thick or so from a year ago, and I just turned this yesterday. So it is a dry bowl. It was dry wood, and it worked a little bit still.
Okay, well, we're a little past 10. Anyone have any final comments you want to make?
I've got quite a bit of the wire that I use to make my loop here. If anyone's out in the Hillsboro, Beaverton area and wants some, or once if we ever get back to meetings, I can bring some then too.
Great, thanks.
The coat hanger works pretty well for that purpose also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's about the right gauge.
If you can
The
find one that's plastic.
Yeah, plastic would not be so good.
Barney?
Yeah, just one quick question. I put it on the chat. I have to make some baby rattles. Any recommendations on the finish for that?
Walnut oil.
Yep. Oil and wax are just actually the a wax finish would be just fine.
Wax okay?
Well, depending on the wax.
Yeah, but walnut oil's okay?
Yeah.
Okay, that's all you
Friction
think.
polish it. You know, heat is your friend. Get that oil set up.
And I think there's a minimum size that it has to be at least like 40 millimeters, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, there's swallowing.
Yeah, if you go online and just check Baby Rattle guidelines, you'll get it real quick. So, okay, well, the next one's going to be in 4 weeks. We're going to try and do this every middle of the month, as long as people are interested, and until we get back to real life. So
Yeah.
thanks, everyone. And there's going to be a recording of this online that I'll send out to everyone. But thanks for your questions and participating.
Thanks.
Have a good weekend.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Thanks all.